I want to welcome Haley. Also, as a reminder, we'll be putting her full bio and all of her amazing accomplishments in the chat as well. But today she's going to be talking to us about beyond guardianship, understanding choices, roles, and rights for autistic individuals. One of the things that, again, as my patient population has grown up with me, as I diagnosed many of them when they were toddlers or now in their early adulthood, navigating supported decision making is a really, really powerful and important topic that many of us need to learn more about. Whether that again is as an autistic person, whether that's as a professional who serves autistic people, or whether that's as a parent or caregiver. So Haley's going to talk to us about navigating supported decision making and guardianship for autistic individuals, and how that can include many considerations. This session is going to explore what guardianship means and less restrictive alternatives such as supported decision making and powers of attorney. She'll also provide a brief overview of guardianship process and considerations, as well as discuss the roles of healthcare professionals, autistic individuals, and caregivers. So excited to hear from her for a balanced, practical conversation that empowers families, professionals, and self advocates to make informed choices. So, for the next 45 minutes, Haley Moss will talk to us about beyond guardianship, understanding choices, roles, and rights for autistic individuals. Haley, so great to see you. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
You too. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day in order to be here. And I'm so glad that we are having this discussion and are super curious and excited. So, a little bit about me as well. So, I'm an attorney by trade and an advocate and educator by choice, is how I always like to describe myself. I am proudly autistic myself, and talking about guardianship is one of those things that to me is really important when we do talk about independence. And a lot of the times I get asked to talk about what independence and autonomy looks like for autistic people. And then I recognize that there are also legal systems and financial systems in place that end up limiting independence and autonomy. And sometimes we're not always aware of how that happens or how that works because caregivers, planners, and all that don't always know what options are available. And they also want to make the decisions and make these decisions either out of fear or just out of ignorance. So sometimes it's up to us to be more informed and learn a little bit more as well. So to get us started, when we talk about guardianship, I always think about what we think it is and what we know it is at the same time. So people often think of guardianship in this very pop culture way right now. Is a few years ago when Britney Spears' plight really came to light. That was the moment that was pretty watershed for mainstream culture to start really talking about guardianship. That they were like, oh my gosh, this is a thing. People can end up being limited or being told to do things that they don't want to do. And we saw this huge Free Britney movement. We saw people talking about conservatorship and guardianship. I will use those terms a little bit interchangeably because depending on the state that you live in, law might be written in a way that has one form of language over another. There are some minute differences depending on state statute because guardianship is not regulated at a federal level that really determine what language gets used. But when we think about it, we really do have this pop culture view of perhaps a controlling situation or something that can be a little bit more sinister, but also well intended. I think that's what happened personally with Britney Spears, is that she was very clearly a person with a disability having a mental health crisis at the time. And her family wanted control and ended up using this to manage her career more so than to help her make decisions that benefited her life. And it's interesting because I get asked about Britney Spears a lot when we talk about this. So that's something I wanted to kind of start with, is this might be what we're thinking, but guardianship actually is a little bit more complex than a pop culture headline or a soundbite you might have heard on the news. When we talk about guardianship, we're really thinking about these processes that courts are appointing a third party to make decisions for somebody. So what happens here is that a judge decides based on a petition made by family members or a lawyer getting involved that somebody is incapacitated and they're unable to make decisions themselves, that they can't make these financial decisions, healthcare decisions, or other major decisions about where they will work, where they will live, all sorts of things, legal authority, that whatever it may be, they can't make decisions and don't have that capacity to do so. And really, what happens with guardianship is these rights are removed from the person, and a guardian is the person who ends up making these decisions on behalf of the individual. And when we think about who the guardian is, that can be a professional third party. There are professional guardians. There was a Netflix movie about professional guardians a few years ago called I Care a Lot. It did not depict guardians in the best of lights. But typically, guardians are family members or caregivers. That usually it's a parent, sometimes it's a sibling, sometimes it's somebody else in the family circle. But there are two different types of guardianships that really happen is you have a plenary or full guardianship or you have a limited guardianship. So a plenary or full guardianship will apply to most people's civil rights that we'll see that it's sort of just every decision across the board will be at the hands of the guardian. When we think about a limited guardianship, that some rights might still be in place, but others may not be. That when we think about guardianship in this light, I really want us to focus on that people's rights are being removed. So when you hear me talk about guardianship, you know that you could probably tell that it's not something I'm the biggest fan of. There's a reason that we have this as beyond guardianship and really exploring alternatives to guardianship whenever we have the options. That something that I will continuously harp on is guardianship is more of a last resort rather than the first line of defense. Historically, we look at guardianship as this first line of defense when really it should be a last resort. And when we think about who is under guardianship today, last time I did a deep dive into statistics on guardianship conservatively we have about 1.5 million adults who are under guardianship or conservatorship according to the AARP. This is what we know of. That is not exhaustive. And most of the people who end up in guardianship aren't people on the spectrum or people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. That's the second largest group. But the majority are adults over the age of 65. So we see this a lot in elder law. We see this a lot when folks will talk about cognitive decline, like Alzheimer's and dementia, or people who have aging parents and grandparents who are unable to start making those major healthcare decisions for themselves, and power of attorney just isn't enough, is usually how a lot of family members will phrase it, is they need someone to do more than healthcare directives. They need everything managed for them so they don't lose all their money to a scammer, that they don't do all of these different poor decisions as their cognition declines as part of getting older. You also do have a small minority of people who are in that Britney Spears camp, as I like to call it, of people with mental health and psychiatric disabilities. But we do have a lot of folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities who end up in here. And we think about young people with IDD in particular, there is an overwhelming amount who end up having a guardian between the ages of 18 and 22. That was around 58%. There are a lot of reasons that guardianship is pushed and that guardianship happens to autistic people in particular. And a lot of it comes from pressure and just not knowing. That when we think about what that looks like, we have decisions being made by financial planners, we have teachers and educators who say you might not have access to your child's files once they turn 18. This is how you're going to get them. Is guardianship is how you get to still have that say in their educational outcomes, because sometimes if you are over 18 and under IDEA, you may still be in secondary school and not necessarily going into voc rehab or college or other post-secondary opportunities and educational opportunities, whatever it may be. So this can end up showing up more often than we think because of that. But what is guardianship at the end of the day really is giving somebody else to all that control to take care of another human being. So it feels and sounds a little bit strange because someone who is a guardian is making major decisions for another human being, that they are deciding where somebody will live. They might be doing their daily care, so they might be the ones who are providing money or the clothes or the furniture or their vehicles themselves. They're also the person who's making medical decisions. So they might be consenting to care or they might be withholding consent to care. Is that person is the sole authority. So if I, for instance, get sick and need to go to the doctor, if I am under a guardianship, that guardian might have to be the one who's making that decision and making that appointment because I don't have those rights or abilities to do that. I think about this a lot because, of course, there's many emergencies that happen and all sorts of different things, and medical care can be exceedingly complex to navigate. Also, guardians are responsible for care, comfort, and overall well-being of the person. as you can see by the amount of control that goes into a guardian, kind of a lot like caring for a very young child, it can be very controlling and has the potential for abuse. That guardianship abuse is something that does happen. It's something that's worth touching on that you can see because someone can withhold care, they cannot adequately provide for you, that there isn't nearly enough oversight as there should be. But it's something that I do want to draw attention to as well when we talk about what guardianship looks like. And guardianship does have this problematic component that I've been kind of getting around to when we talk about this, on top of the fact that, this can be a problem because of potential abuse. But when we think about the rights that people can lose under guardianship, they are pretty vast. That you will hear advocates refer to guardianship as what is known as a civil death, because your civil rights can and will be taken away under full or plenary guardianships unless you're really writing to make sure that certain things are not there. So, just for example, here's some of the rights that somebody might not have under a guardianship. They might not be able to have their driver's license. You, in certain jurisdictions, you may also lose the right to vote. That guardianship is one of the very few ways you can lose your right to vote. And it's also the one thing that if it's not it kind of carved out in guardianship, the one thing that a guardian can't do on behalf of an individual is vote for them. That is voter fraud. So votes are the one thing that is truly protected if you did not lose your right to vote. And this is a really big one when we talk about the right to vote when it comes to guardianship, because it's something that people don't recognize can get lost. I actually have heard this story because I've served on committees to push for less restrictive alternatives to guardianship. Is a parent took their son to court, got the guardianship approved, and he was, of course, over 18. That's just part of how it goes. And once the guardianship was approved, she asked the judge, now, how do I get to register my son to vote? Because I can do that now. And she didn't recognize that just moments before, she had stripped her son of the right to vote through that full guardianship. You might also not be able to manage your own money or property. That if you are a homeowner, if there is a trust, if there's some other entity that they are the ones that are dispersing money, they're the ones who are managing it, they are the ones who own or pay rent, they do all that types of stuff, decide where you might live, make those healthcare decisions and say yes or no to different treatments. Your right to work may also be restricted, so you might not be able to work somewhere that the guardian disapproves of. And guardianship can also be an issue when it comes to dating and relationships. So, folks under guardianship may not be able to get married without the approval of the guardian. It sounds like asking your parents for permission to go on a school field trip. I have no better way to describe this to you. But there are folks who don't end up having those marriages or those relationships that they want to. Even going back to Britney Spears, I remember when things were coming out about her conservatorship that she was dating someone and it was so frowned upon, and she couldn't get married to this guy that she wanted to get married to because of the arrangement. That's just some ideas of how you can end up losing rights and things that we simply take for granted. And getting out of a guardianship is very difficult. It is an expensive process, and a lot of people with disabilities are in poverty. We have different access to money. If your money is being managed or controlled by a third party, how are you going to be able to hire someone to essentially stand up for your rights and maybe challenge this arrangement? But there are some hopes now. So recently for lawyers in particular, because we've been in a very tough spot when it comes to guardianship, and a lot of lawyers and individuals don't recognize they can challenge guardianship arrangements, that we've had updates to our professional responsibility rules back in February. So there's a rule for my lawyer friends and those who spend time in the legal field, known as the American Bar Association's Model Rule 1.14. If you are a lawyer, this is what you might remember as the diminished capacity rule. That has been revised to be more inclusive back in February. So now it's decision-making limitations. That way we aren't necessarily contributing to stigma. We have more inclusive language in the rule. But something that was really interesting in there, because the goals are also to provide access to justice for individuals, especially those with cognitive disabilities and differences, that attorneys also now have guidance to ethically represent somebody who is under a guardianship or a conservatorship and they want to challenge or modify that arrangement. Because sometimes you might be thinking this isn't in that person's best interest, or can I really challenge this? And sometimes attorneys were very afraid to go near it. So having additional guidance is something that's really awesome and hopefully a step forward to getting out of these arrangements. When you really look deep into guardianship challenges and battles, you would notice they are very expensive, they are very public, they are a drawn out process, that it's not always easy. There's also control because I remember there was one case here in Florida where the person's cell phone was managed and monitored by the guardian, and they had to figure out how to even call legal advocacy groups to be able to challenge that arrangement. And that person did end up winning their autonomy and independence back. But just hearing some of these stories can be really freaky if you're not expecting it or don't recognize just how deep guardianship can end up running. And you're probably thinking, how do we end up in guardianships in the first place, other than that we're told that it's a good idea? Because that's what it sounds like is, okay, this is a good idea. We're going to do this. We need to be able to be present. We need to be able to help make decisions. And parents of autistic children really kind of rest on this assumption sometimes that they'll always be able to make decisions for a child or always be present somehow. And that is true. Parents are lifelong human beings in a child's life, God willing, and that they are able to be there for that adult child. But sometimes those decisions and decision-making powers kind of come to an end when a child turns 18. Is when you are considered a legal adult, you don't have that same autonomy over somebody and control that you would for a minor child, that you might not have access to educational records. There might be issues with things like FERPA and all of that as well. When we think about how do I get access to my kids' care and even healthcare decisions, that as much as I know there are times that family members would have loved to have made appointments for me, they can make those appointments, but they can't force me to go, for instance. And when we think about that, there's also concerns about competence or understanding of different things. So if you're signing legal documents, if you're signing financial documents, those things are complicated for anybody. If you have an intellectual disability or a cognitive disability or are autistic and can be easily trusting or naive on these things, it can be a genuine concern that somebody is going to get swindled or taken advantage of. And we're concerned that their competence might not be where it should be when it comes to these very important decisions that are made that can make or break somebody's life in some way, shape, or form. Or we might be thinking this person can't care for their daily needs, and we need to make sure they're constantly provided for. If you are thinking about they're constantly being provided for, we also have different situations and living situations that you might not be independent. You might not live with your family forever. You might be in a planned community of sorts, or you might also be in a group home. It really does depend. And there's also a lot of pressure to go with guardianship. And this usually comes from financial planners, educators, lawyers, and other professionals, is there is what is known as the school to guardianship pipeline. So the school to guardianship pipeline really does start with that educational pressure in particular of this is how you can stay involved in your child's educational journey. This is how you get to keep making these decisions. You have to do a guardianship. And I have heard from families over the years who go, something about this just seems off. And then they recognize just how encompassing a guardianship could be, and it just doesn't seem like a great idea. Something else that shows up a lot is just a lack of awareness of other options. There are other options to and alternatives to guardianship, which we will be talking about today as well. That's what I really want to focus on more than just talking about why guardianship probably is not the best idea. But when we do think about guardianship, I am not here to say to abolish it completely. Although in an ideal world, we don't need it, but look at guardianship more as a last resort than anything else. That if a less restrictive alternative is not feasible for any reason, that this person is completely incapacitated, cannot make a decision, should not make a decision, and the support of other human beings isn't adequate for that, then maybe we can consider a guardianship. That if you are, for instance, in a coma and never going to wake up, that I mean, that's usually when people get things like power of attorney, but that might be a time you're thinking, in the event they do wake up and are significantly changed or unable to do anything, maybe it is best we have a guardianship to make sure they're provided for. Just an example to keep this conversation moving when we talk about guardianship. So what are our different alternatives to guardianship? That we have a couple different things that we can chat about here. I am not a financial planner, so I am not going to go very deep on the trust and savings accounts, but trust and savings accounts are also a great way to make sure that somebody is able to keep their civil rights as well. There's something that is known as ABLE accounts and different ways that you're able to provide for individuals with disabilities that doesn't run amok of that asset cap if they're receiving Social Security or other benefits from the government. So that is something to keep in mind, and a financial planner can guide you in that direction if that's something that's interested to you. But really, the big things that come up here are supported decision making as the least restrictive alternative to guardianship. We also have representative payees when it comes to things like Social Security and other benefits to make sure that they're managed properly. We have power of attorney for medical and legal decisions, and we also have person-centered planning. So we're going to dive in a little bit on each of these and really kind of understand, but we're going to have a larger focus on supported decision making because that is the way of the future and the least restrictive alternative if that's something that's interest to you. So here's kind of our breakdown of what these alternatives will look like other than SDM. So what we have with our representative payees is this is somebody who is appointed by the Social Security Administration. If you are someone who is receiving SSI or SSDI, you might have a representative payee. That person's appointed by the SSA and they help ensure that that money is used correctly while also allowing them to make other important decisions. So if you're just like, I have no idea how to manage my benefits, I don't know how to use it, that's where a representative payee might be essentially helpful. And then we have in financial planning world, we have special or supplemental needs trusts, depending on the term of art that you like to use. I always call it a supplemental needs trust because special needs just grinds my gears personally. It is not something I like to use, but the term of art legally can be considered special needs trust. So that SNT. In these types of trusts, you really get to oversee and choose someone who spends money in that trust on behalf of that person. And trusts are a great way as well to make sure that you're not affecting somebody's eligibility for benefits such as Medicaid or SSI, that you're able to spend money that is set aside or have somebody spending money set aside for this person so that they can still make other decisions in their lives. So it's just really managing that financial aspect. And this is if they're receiving more money or not receiving money from the government. So if you have assets that you want to pass down to your children someday, I think about that for parents, that if you have an inheritance or you want that to be managed when you're not here, a trust might be a great way to do that. Another big one is also the power of attorney. This one I actually encounter a lot. And this one I encounter outside of autism world too. This is this formal legal document that really just allows someone to act on somebody else's behalf if they are unable to make certain decisions. And usually those decisions are healthcare or financial. So if something happens to you and you can't consent to a surgery, for instance, and you're in the hospital, a power of attorney document, and this might be just part of a regular estate plan or emergency planning for many people, that you have someone who's appointed to be the one that tells the doctor, we're going to do this operation because it's do or die at the moment. And clearly, if something bad happened to you, you couldn't make that consent on your own. But person-centered planning is that approach that I would like to see, especially with our transition age autistic people, is when we have this team-based problem-solving process that really helps people plan for the futures and really empowers that person to gain control over their own life. It seems a little bit less formal. So when we have this person-centered planning, we really do want to make sure that the individual is at the center. If anything, we want the individual to be at the center of all of these different alternatives to guardianship, while guardianship itself isn't the one that centers the individual for you. That guardianship can be the one that it's how do we make sure that they are taken care of, not necessarily how do we make sure that they are still in control and able to be as independent as possible. Which brings us to supported decision making, which is my all-time favorite to talk about. When we talk about supported decision making, we're really thinking about this series of relationships, practices, arrangements, and agreements of any degree of formality and intensity that are designed to assist somebody to make and communicate to others decisions about their lives. So sometimes you will see a formal agreement. I usually try to push to have some kind of SDM agreement if possible for folks. And something about supported decision making that makes it really interesting when you have this definition is it's something that we use all the time, even if you don't have a disability, that you probably have friends and family and other advisors that are helping you keep important decisions in order. that if you are, I know this is April, that not only is it Autism Month, it's also tax month. If you are working with a tax professional and have signed anything that says that that tax professional can speak on your behalf to the IRS, for instance, that can be considered and construed as some form of supported decision making that you're like, okay, I am letting this person make and communicate decisions about my finances in this particular case because I'm not equipped to do that. And that's okay. And that has nothing to do with disability. So I really like supported decision making to go back to this idea of interdependence and really thinking about how we are able to rely on our community and other people to do things and help us be as independent as possible. Because sometimes independence doesn't mean do it all yourself. It means knowing when and how to ask for help or assistance with something. That we don't need to hold people with disabilities or autistic people to a wholly different standard. So when we do think about SDM in particular, not only are we all using it, but it's encouraging self-advocacy. And if you have ever heard me talk at anything, you know that I love self-advocacy. I am a huge fan. And when we think about self-advocacy skills, we're really trying to empower people to make choices affecting their daily lives and let them be more independent. That there's the self-advocacy movement that's personal and political and really letting people speak for themselves, make their own decisions, and take control over their own lives, whatever that may look like for you or the person that you love. I think that's really important. And having that ability to say, I want to make this decision. I don't feel comfortable with this. I need more help with it. That's good for anybody, in fact, that we want self-advocacy to be at the forefront of major decisions in our lives, whether it is something like buying a house or a car or deciding what medical care I should or shouldn't be receiving. So the supported decision-making process is pretty straightforward that we have four major steps that you're choosing, discussing, planning, and signing. So we're going to kind of walk through this together that when we're choosing things in a supported decision making scenario, we have that person with a disability or autistic person as the decision maker. They have the final say here. Think of them as the CEO, that they are the CEO of their life, and everybody else is in that picture as well, because not everything is a one person business, right? So we have people that are helping that CEO who are the supporters and the CEO of their life. So we have the supporters, and supporters have to agree to be supporters. Just like at a company, you don't just volunteer, you are an employee. So think of support. If this is a major company, we have the CEO and then we have a bunch of employees. And we're not really going through the levels of seniority and importance and all that good stuff. And when we have supporters, they can be a huge range of people. They can be family members, they can be friends, and they can be professionals. You can have one supporter, you can have five supporters, you can have your trusted counsel of people that you trust and want to rely on for advice in certain situations. And that's awesome. That really building community is a huge part of supported decision making. And then we have discussions that we are able to discuss between the individual and the supporters how and where somebody needs support. Is there really is no one size fits all because every person's needs are different. So my needs might look very different than somebody who might not live alone, for instance. So maybe we're going to buy a car. I always use buying a car as kind of my supported decision making example. I think it's probably the most simplistic and the one that many of us have been through at least sometime of in our lives that we have bought or leased a vehicle. And you have probably done a lot of research. You've spoken to people, you've gone to the dealership, you've gone to five dealerships, you've done so much work to make this transaction possibly happen. Is that there are things, and you might need more support than others. Maybe you're not a good negotiator, and that's okay. So you might need support in some areas more than others. So sometimes folks might need help with housing, others might need help with healthcare and finances, and others with employment. Really, I think healthcare and finances are the two biggest ones that you see guardianship and restricted alternatives or less restrictive alternatives really showing up because managing finances is difficult for most of us, and healthcare decisions can be very complicated. There's a lot of jargon, there is a lot of uncertainty navigating health insurance or benefits related to that, and financial benefits, whether it's Medicaid, SSI, SSDI, all of that can be increasingly complicated. I find myself saying a lot of the times that I don't know the ins and outs of Social Security. It is beyond my expertise and level of knowledge too. So I totally understand if that is something that needs to be discussed with other people. And what we're going to be doing when it comes to planning for supported decision making is that you're going to create a document that outlines how the individual will be supported. This is known as an SDM agreement. That maybe we're going to put all sorts of different things in there. You might have attorneys for this. It also depends because I know some jurisdictions do have SDM laws on the books, which is super exciting. I have been on committees to get supported decision making passed in Florida. So it's something I feel very strongly about and I'm glad to see. And you also do have a need for this in the trust and estate space as well, and all financial planning too. And when we have SDM, you might have an attorney involved to help formalize this agreement, but it doesn't have to be super formal all the time. But that agreement and document might have plans about how we're going to make decisions. Maybe we're going to meet and review these things once a month and talk about them. Maybe we're going to figure out what the best way to ask questions is. Are we going to do this in person? Are we going to do this virtually? How do we best receive explanations and notices? This is something that comes up as well with trust and estates planning too. I was at a trust and estates conference last month, and we were talking a lot about how do we communicate different things to beneficiaries. And usually the beneficiary would be someone here who has a disability, for instance, and whether we call them or put it in writing. And something I found myself saying is do it in plain language because attorneys often forget that there might be limited understanding or decision-making capability, and making sure that people understand their rights and what is happening to them or around them is really important and empowering. And once we have that agreement, we get to sign it. So I like to look at SDM as this huge process that happens. So when we do this process, we need to know the person. And kind of going back to that car buying example, when we know a person, we know that they're saying, I want a car. Awesome. And when we think about that decision, they're going to describe it and identify it. That's the next thing you do in supported decision making. So you're saying, I really want a car. And we will also then talk about why we want a car, for instance. Maybe we just want to be more independent. Maybe getting our driver's license is that number one priority. And then figuring out what that person's desire is. So maybe what their preference is for that decision too. And they're thinking, I really want a convertible. I want to put the top down and enjoy the sun and feel all the warmth on my face. And that is easier for me because I could also hear more stuff outside in a convertible. Awesome. And then we're going to meet with our supporters and all of that. And they're going to go, Haley, as much as that convertible might make you the coolest person on the block, have you thought about the fact, one, it rains a lot, two, you might have other maintenance associated with a sports car, and chances are it is a two-seater car that doesn't have a lot of trunk space. So when you end up going shopping or doing other things, you might not be able to fit as much in your car as you thought you would. That might be stuff a supporter would be saying in this example. And then at our next step, when we are deciding if we're going to keep that decision or substitute something else, that's a huge part of it. That we're going to go, I've been thinking about that convertible, and you're right. I do end up going to the grocery store a lot, and I don't think I could fit all my groceries in there. Maybe I should get a sedan instead. And that's something we can talk about in that agreement and all of that different stuff. And then we make that decision. Awesome. Now that I've thought about it more concretely with the help of my trusted advisors and circle of people I know have my best interests at heart, I am going to get a four-door sedan. And then we have to think about the decisions to get there. Are we going to get a used car? Are we going to get a new car? Am I someone who can go to the dealership and talk to a salesperson and negotiate and work accordingly on that? Personally, that is not my forte. I would love to have someone there. And having been through the car process in real life before, I took my dad with me. My dad went with me when we got my first car. And I remember being like, this is so beyond me. I would not know how to talk about this. I would not know how to do this. This is scary for anybody. And then we're implementing that decision and having advocacy as necessary. So when I did get my first car as a teenager, it was super exciting. It was super awesome. And I was just like, wow, amazing. And we came to those decisions as a team, is how I like to look at it. If we are looking at this from a guardianship perspective, you are not getting to go through this whole interactive process of, I want a car. This is what I think I need for my car. This is what I would like. In guardianship, you were handed a vehicle and you are told, here is your car. This is your car. You need to let me know when it needs fuel. You can't fuel it up yourself. I'm also going to keep track of the mileage so I know when you were driving the car. And I also needed to tell me where you're going, and the GPS surveillance will always be on in the car. That is how I like to look at the guardianship version of this, rather than I'm just helping you get something that will help you get to where you want to go so you can have your job, you can do the things that you need to and want to do. And once we have all that, we get to sign our agreement that's formally recognized if we want to have that, of course. And that formal document shows that everyone is undertaking supported decision making. And this is really great, especially when you're working with professionals, not necessarily someone like a salesperson in the car all the time, but that's also a great place to use this. That it helps doctors, bankers, lawyers, and others feel really confident in accepting that person's decision because there is this stigma, especially for a lot of us, about decision-making limitations, as the new ethics rules for lawyers will outline, that maybe we don't feel confident, but we know that, okay, we can support you, you understand something, you know what you're doing, and you're competent to make these decisions, and you have people in your pocket, in your circle that can help you. So we're not going to be as afraid of malpractice or lawsuits on that end. So a lot of folks do feel comfortable with this. This is also great if you're going to a doctor's appointment and there's concerns about confidentiality or the like, as we're thinking, okay, great, we can keep rolling with this. We're in a good place and we're able to keep moving in the right direction too. So that is a lot of what I have on guardianship. I do want to be as cognizant as possible because I know this is something that does bring a lot of questions, a lot of feelings, a lot of kind of debate. And I wanted to make space for that so we can have those discussions together about what guardianship can look like, what those SDM alternatives can look like. And I thank you all for taking the time to learn, be open-minded, and hopefully explore what is best for you, your family, the people you know and love, and have more tools in your back pocket to make an informed decision.
I absolutely thank you for that presentation. This is something that I, again, just thinking of from my perspective as a clinician, I'm getting these questions more and more, again, as my patients kind of get a little bit older. And Haley, that was so good, so helpful in helping us just understand what we're talking about. What are our options? What are the different things? So thank you for that. And you're right, we have a bunch of questions. So I'm glad that we have a little bit of time, hopefully, to get to a couple of them. So certainly, thank you for that. So I'm going to just look to my side for a minute while I pull over the questions. But a couple of people are asking things about professional guardians, so like public administrators, things like that.
Hmm.
And I think this is more of a kind of a reflection comment, not necessarily like a question per se, but people are curious about what happens when a professional guardian or a public administrator has hundreds of people that they're the guardian for. And like, what are ways that I guess the question is kind of thinking about like how do we make sure that that is we as people who maybe have to sign off on things like that, that people are protected or that they're safe in those kind of very big kind of collective guardianship environments. Any suggestions there?
Oh, I
It's
think it's
tricky.
all about accountability,
Okay.
honestly, and being able to check in with your professional guardian. And also, they usually have to generate some kind of report.
Okay.
But that's also something I'm always concerned with professional guardians, but that's just me. But
Yeah.
I also know that there is the potential for abuse throughout the entire system, and knowing how do we challenge this? How do we have the ability to go and replace the guardian if needed or if wanted? And also, how does that individual, if the individual is saying, I don't like this, remember, they don't have a lot of rights under a guardianship. So it's often in our best interest as the family or figuring out how do we challenge this arrangement. And that's my biggest fear is that guardianship is not cheap to challenge. It is a long process and justice moves slowly, unfortunately. So really just having that accountability, I think, is the number one thing.
Very helpful. Thank you.
And they're also they do regulate a lot of professional guardians, like they have training and background checks and all of that types of stuff that they have fiduciary duties, but still,
Mhm. Yeah.
it's
Okay. Very
complicated.
It is complicated. And I think that, again, talks like yours help all of us to be more informed and more aware. And that leads to a couple of other questions that people have asked, which is things like when are the best times to start talking about this with, I'm going to use the pediatric perspective, but children and families. So thinking about, I know that I start talking about transition to adulthood around age 12, and that often does
Mhm.
start to include conversations about decision making. But from your perspective, when is a good time to start having these conversations?
So I think this is very dependent on the families too, but when it comes to guardianship and less restrictive alternatives, I think the earlier the better because a
Mhm.
lot of you are probably doing financial planning when your children are little. That
Mhm.
I know even from experience and from things that my family has shared with me, they started planning when I was small because they were thinking, and I know many parents of autistic children are going to be thinking, what happens when I'm not here? I am afraid for that situation. So that being said, estate planning generally and financial planning should be top of mind at any point. So if you're going the trust route in particular, that's really important. And if you know that you are hitting that transition to adulthood stage, depending on waivers and lists and all that stuff when it comes to SSI, SSDI, Medicaid, if you know that's part of your plan, you should start planning for that immediately. I do think some of these things are more urgent per se when it comes to adults. So
Mhm.
think about you even as the family member yourself that you might have a power of attorney for what if you have a medical emergency or that you have had to do elder care related to your family members as well. That's the weird thing with this topic in particular is it ends up affecting not just your children, but you might have been in a situation where you're planning for elder relatives in your life. I have seen that firsthand too. I have seen that with even family members in my family, is that they were being the power of attorney for my grandparents at some point and things like that. That's something that happens to a lot of us. So there is no perfect age to plan, but I do think when we're thinking more about SDM and person-centered planning, that having them involved in the patient or the child or the autistic person involved, if they're able to understand in a way that makes sense to them, you can of course use plain language, you can simplify the way you're explaining this so somebody can get the most out of it and still be present because again, we want to preserve as much independence as possible and also take into account what they want. I feel like guardianship forgets what somebody wants because I'm not gonna, if you tell me you might not be able to pick something, you might not be able to pick your job, you might not be able to vote, I might say, you sure about that? Like, if you explain that to me, I'm just gonna say, I don't want that. I think a lot of us would be in that boat. I think that's a pretty fair assessment is I don't want that, but do I need that? Is a different question too. Like, what do you want? What do you need? And that's just basic self-advocacy and advocacy. So the age that I would start planning probably depends on what your needs really are. If you're thinking about that adulthood transition, I do think when you said 12, I do think that's very fair. But I
Mhm.
also think the financial planning, you're probably the financial side of it, if you're thinking about financial decisions, you're planning earlier and
Mhm.
starting to plan that healthcare advocacy closer to adulthood because maybe you do want to keep going to doctor's appointments well past 18.
Mhm. Yeah.
I
No.
know I used to bring someone else with me to doctor's appointments forever because I would always forget to say something, or
Yep.
I'd forget like why I was going, or I was just afraid.
Yeah. All
And
also
and a lot of us do it.
yes.
I think a lot of us, whether you're neurodivergent, neurotypical, autistic, or not autistic, you have used this in some way, and that's why I'm such a big fan of it,
Yep.
is you probably have been scared at least once in your life and have brought a friend or family member to a doctor's appointment, a major negotiation. You have done something before.
Agreed.
And
I
that's what
always
SDM really is.
Yes, agreed. And I actually was reflecting as you shared some of those examples, particularly about car buying. But, as the mom of two now adult children, it's thinking about the fact that I'm constantly helping them think about decisions. My son's looking
Especially
at new
those big ones.
jobs. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And
And
yet
a lot of
I,
this, the focus is around the major life decisions, like legal
yep,
decisions, medical decisions, healthcare decisions. Those are usually the big and financial decisions. Like
yep.
those are the big ones that everybody really gets in on this with, because that's the decisions that are difficult for anybody. But if you do have some kind of decision-making limitations or cognitive differences, that can be exceptionally hard.
Hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. So another question, which I also really appreciate, is supported decision making used in conjunction with other arrangements like a representative payee, for example? The person is asking, if the individual wants to spend all of their money, and I hear this a lot from
Mhm.
families, on something frivolous and can't be convinced that they need money for expenses like food and housing, are
Mhm.
there options to kind of combine supported decision making with other forms of more decisive control or decisive
I
planning?
would believe so that you can definitely mix it, having a representative payee and then figuring and then take your, okay, I got my money from Social Security. How do I manage this?
Yeah.
and then
And,
working through that as a team. And that's also part of person-centered planning too.
okay. Perfect. That's helpful.
That those things
And
can all interact together because when you look at something that like a representative payee or a trust, there are other human beings involved.
mhm, yeah, agreed.
It's not the same as I'm spending your money for you that the rep payee is administering.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a fine line. I have a few examples of parents who are in the representative payee
Mm-hmm.
role, and I know that we've had to have some conversations between my now adult patient and the parent. And again, as a pediatric clinician, that's a frame shift, right? So I'm used to being in that space where parents are, you know, I like to think co-piloting, even when
Mm-hmm.
their children are under the age of 18, but definitely when they are in their own decision-making capacity, my patient that is, as an adult, helping parents make that shift, that mindset
Mm-hmm.
shift from like, I'm in charge, I'm deciding these things, and these are in situations where they are not the legal guardian,
And
definitely
it's a
takes,
dynamic that's complicated to navigate because
it
you're like,
is,
I'm in this professional-ish role with a legal obligation to you, on top of the fact I am your parent or
right.
caregiver.
Yes, yes,
So that's
exactly.
a
And I
whole
think,
other science and kind of Pandora's box to open.
yeah, I agree. I agree. And just another comment, and we'll get to some more questions here in a minute. But I think just for those of us who are in this space, and again, whether it is, honestly, I think it actually applies to everyone who's likely listening today. But
Hmm.
there are fundamental ways of shifting the way that you think about things as
Hmm.
people go through life, right? And so I know, again, I'll
Exactly.
just speak for myself, but as my kids got older, I had to fundamentally shift from that,
Hmm.
I am actively, you know, I don't think controlling, but like actively managing or actively
Hmm.
engaged in managing things with them or for them to, okay, well, here are my thoughts about this. I'm kind of moving into, again, to kind of use the medical model, but that consultative fashion. So, like, I'm going to give you some
Yeah.
thoughts and things to consider. But for
Hmm.
parents, that I think is a really important thing to understand. And what I sometimes see from my perspective is
Hmm.
that that's a hard shift for some people to
It
make.
is.
It's tough.
And I think something else that I didn't get to really talk about in that shift is even just how dynamic disability is and autism can be, which is also why when we talk about planning really early on, it can be a little bit scary because the needs that somebody has at 3 or 12 might not be what they need at 22. And we're making assumptions and guessing who they might be as they grow up, which is why I am like, what is the least restrictive thing? So then we can modify more accordingly. Because if you have someone who's struggling as a teenager and decide a guardianship down the line seems like the right move, and then they hit 18, you're like, they're going to be fine. They're going to college. They're
Yep.
going to be on their own. It doesn't sound like it makes sense, and you don't want to commit or start that process and really get far along before realizing I did something really wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. I
So
completely agree.
knowing that dynamic nature and also we change like we all change throughout the life cycle. I know I always say my functioning is day to day. Is that there are days I am quote unquote high functioning, if that's the words that you like to use, because people love to use high functioning, low functioning. I don't. And there are days I'm not. Like
Yeah.
I have no better way to describe it because this is very dynamic and you can paint a different portrait of me depending on what needs that I have that you can say that I need a lot more professional support because I do struggle with a lot of independent living stuff. It's a miracle that I haven't burned down the place, is always my joke, because I am not great at monitoring different things. I struggle to keep my laundry moving. I struggle to get all this stuff done. But then it's like, well, you also have a job, you can manage your finances, you've been a homeowner before, like you've done all this stuff. And then there's this incongruous part of it.
Yep.
So
I,
figuring out that dynamic nature of everything is also a great way to keep growing with that consultative advisory role that you were talking about too, is
mhm.
realizing that dynamic does change and that human being changes.
Yes, agreed. As a developmental pediatrician or and someone who specializes in development, I love to say that we don't stop developing at the age of
No.
18, right? Like I am marveling over the way that I think about things now that I'm in my, middle ages. And so think because it's fascinating, just the different ways
Hmm.
that I see things. And so I love that, you're right, that as all of us are continuing to grow and change. And that's important for us to recognize. A couple of questions have come in about how do we, or I guess, who is the kind of professional that a parent, an autistic person, whomever, it should direct people to essentially help them with understanding their decisions. So, for example, people are asking, is it an attorney? Is it a specific kind of attorney? Are there other avenues that people should consider looking into?
It really depends, first and foremost, what you're trying to accomplish. So certain places you can go, like if you're doing like rep pay, there's also you might not need an attorney. You might not. Some of this is also financial planning that you might want to talk to a financial advisor. For more formal things, I do think an attorney is really great, but something else that you should have in your back pocket and that a lot of these organizations and nonprofits do is your state's protection and advocacy organization. So every state has a mandated P&A organization,
Mhm.
and those different protection and advocacy organizations sometimes or usually do have some sort of stance on this. They will do all sorts of different trainings and resources and be able to point you in the right direction when it comes to restrictions to alternative return restrictions on guardianship, alternatives to guardianship. Some of them are actually very adamant and say we are not helping you get a guardianship, which I think is very interesting that it is politicized on a state level in some way, shape, or form. But really having those options and places to talk to. It is something as a matter of policy that this should and has been talked about in the past that this should be mandated and oversight at the federal level, but it is a state level legal issue, which is why I'm not giving anything super specific depending on where you live, that your state laws might be different. And certain state laws do have SDM on the books and how it's recognized under the statute and things like that too. So there's a lot to talk about here. But there are attorneys that do this, and there are great resources as well.
Great. Okay, that's super helpful.
I am not one of them. I don't do this because
Yeah.
I always tell people I'm not client facing just because I was not client facing in my legal career just because the empathy overload and I'm like I will not do your guardianship stuff, but I can probably connect you to somebody who can.
Yeah, great. And thank you for sharing that because you're right, empathy overload is also real in many of our professions. So appreciate that comment. So, some other kind of practical questions that are coming in,
Mhm.
things like how recently, and I do suspect this depends on states, but how recently does a psychological evaluation have to be completed to seek guardianship or have legal decision making kind of category assigned?
I am not 100% sure, and I would my best guess would be probably a case by case
I
basis,
was thinking too.
based on the medical hit and healthcare history of a human being, and a judge will re
Mhm.
because guardianship petitions go before a judge.
Mhm.
So the
Right.
judge will be the one making those determinations, and it might get sent down for further evaluation, or we need more information to say yes or no.
Fair. That
That
makes a
a
lot of
good
sense.
like a good trier of fact or a judge will not just rubber stamp things for the heck of rubber stamping it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, and to that point, so thinking about those of us who may be in a position to complete guardianship affidavit kind of things. So I
Hmm.
get these fairly often. Um, what essentially help us understand like what is the role of the healthcare professional? So if say physician or psychologist, um,
Hmm.
in the what I'm getting at is in like that total package that then goes before the judge. Because I think sometimes what I hear from my healthcare colleagues is like, "Oh, I don't know how to do that. I'm not do I can't make that decision." And I'm like, "Well, you're contributing information to
Hmm.
someone who
Yeah,
then."
contributing information, I like that take, but I also do what I did when I was in practice. Who is the client? Who is the patient? You're acting in their interest,
Yeah.
not the family member's best interest. Just because it might be more convenient or seem like the parent's best idea, is it in the patient's best interest to sign off on this?
Yep.
I think
Yeah.
that can be a good principle to keep in mind and to have those discussions with the families if you don't think it's in their best interest or don't feel comfortable.
Yeah, I
Because
completely agree.
you're not the parent's not your patient.
Right. Exactly. And I
Just like
think
we
that
have that, we would talk about that a lot in legal when you have clients with decision-making limitations, is that's your client, not their caregiver, not the interpreter. It's just like when you're with someone who's deaf, you're not talking to their interpreter, you're talking to them.
yep.
The interpreter might be
100%.
helping you understand what they're saying, but the interpreter is not the person.
hmm Yeah, exactly. And I think super well
And
said. And
that's
I want to
something
make
that
sure.
gets forgotten a lot is
Mhm.
think about the person. The person is first. Like I know that sounds so obvious when I say it out loud, but you're here for the person.
Yeah,
Remember
I
who your
agree.
patient or your client is.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think for those of my physician colleagues and psychology colleagues as well, those of us who are in these spots, that is crazy important to make sure that we're thinking about what are we being asked to do and for whom. And so thank you for highlighting
Hmm.
that. I think that's really, really important. Okay, so there's a bunch of questions about kind of people who have intellectual disability. And
Hmm.
so the questions range from things like if a person is considered permanently and totally disabled by the state, which I'm sure that's got some nuance behind it,
So
does
that's
that
a
mean,
nuance, and that's a that has to be a legal term of art. And your
yes,
jurisdiction might have a very specific definition of what that means.
yeah, that's what I was thinking too. But does that mean, so if that has been a determination assigned by somebody, does that mean you
Hmm.
have to um, get guardianship of that person if that determine, again, intense intellectual
I would want to
disability?
see the language of what that determination is and what that applies to,
Okay, yeah, that makes
rather
sense.
than just say you have to or don't have to.
Yep, I think that's fair. So another great question is thinking about once a guardianship is in place, how is it monitored, modified, or terminated if their capacity changes over time?
It is supposed to be monitored by the court, that there's usually reports and different things that are supposed to be there for oversight. Each state has different regulations around guardianship. But challenging it is something that the family can do. It's something that the guardians can, I believe they can, but also the individual can challenge it. And that's what attorneys have always been afraid of, can the individual challenge or modify this? It's just usually very difficult to modify, and it's a long process and an expensive one. So that's also why you don't see as many guardianship modifications as you would think you would if capacity and things change over time, just because of the different procedural obstacles to even get to that point.
Fair. Thank you. A couple of questions
People
also
forget
came
that
in.
this legal stuff is expensive. It's
Yeah, I know. And I think
an
that's as
expensive
some
procedure because I've actually talked to people that said we know guardianship's the right thing for us, but we're not doing it just because it's so expensive.
exactly. And I think to myself that, first of all, that's tough to swallow in the fact that, not that I think people need to have guardianship necessarily, and in fact,
Mhm.
I usually don't. However, um, I want people to have good, sound legal
Mhm.
support in making those decisions and in thinking through all of these things like you've kind of talked to us
Yeah.
about today. And it's
And you can
expensive.
also talk to legal, like different legal aid groups
Hmm.
can also, and nonprofits can also be really helpful because they usually do have some knowledge on this because they do a lot of elder law issues.
Uh,
Because a lot of the times this gets folded as an elder care issue more so than a disability rights issue.
yeah,
So
yeah.
sometimes your elder law people might be the people who really know this.
Okay, that's helpful. Okay, one or two more questions, and then we'll wrap
Like
up
I
and
know
get
that
ready.
sounds kind of unexpected, but I always throw that out there. Is you that even when I was working on advocacy for SDM, the biggest people that were kind of the ones we'd butt heads with were real property, probate, and trusts people, and a lot of
Mhm.
them were in elder or trusts.
Fair. Yeah, and that's
So
been my
there's a lot of
experience too.
different people who have kind of a dog in this fight, for lack of a
Mhm.
better description.
Mhm. Yeah, fair. That makes sense. Okay, so a couple of questions. People are asking kind of along the same similar lines. So if someone is a person's legal guardian, so they're over
Hmm.
18 and a
Hmm.
parent, for example, is their legal guardian, does that give the legal guardian the right to force that person to take medications? Or
Yes.
say it again?
Yes.
Okay,
That
that's what I thought.
you're the one that provides or withholds care.
Okay, yeah, helpful. And I think
That and
also,
that was something that was very big in Britney Spears is that she was put on birth control and forced to have birth control that she did not want because she wanted to have another baby.
yeah, yeah,
But she
yeah,
forcibly did, I believe, have an IUD because of the guardianship,
wow. Okay.
even though she didn't want that.
So definitely important information for us to understand. And I think again, just how so little is taught to those of us again in developmental disabilities because a lot of us are in the pediatric spaces, and so I'm so thankful for the information that you're sharing with us today. Couple one other question that I wanted to ask is thinking about options. So, for example, like preserving the right to vote. Are there
Mhm.
opportunities? Let's imagine we're in a situation where guardianship, we're down the path. That's the process we're going through is to a family has decided that they want to receive or be made guardian for their loved one.
Mhm.
Can they ask the judge to carve out rights like driving or voting, things like that?
That would be a limited guardianship with those kind of provisions that you can put in there.
Okay, makes sense.
And
All
you
right.
can try to depend and also check your state civil rights laws as well.
Okay, fair,
And
fair.
state law on guardianship and what that looks like, because some of them do provide for full versus limited guardianship.
Makes
And you
sense.
can always try to just go for, I would, in that case, I would be going for a limited guardianship.
Okay, got it. Okay. Thank you. That's super helpful. I will also share, just thinking about voting, I have so many people in my practice that are passionate about politics and frankly, way more informed than a lot of folks. And so I just can't imagine removing their ability to vote,
Mhm.
even though they may have significant support needs in other areas of their life. I have a lot of people who have strong opinions and are well informed. I'm talking about my patients, so autistic people. And again, I think that's important. If we don't fully understand some of these concepts, then we may inadvertently
Yeah.
significantly limit,
Yeah.
important
I
aspects.
also, yeah, and I did see a comment as well about the medications and medical treatment as
Yeah,
well. So I did wanted to just
sure.
clarify as well that that's something that could end up going back before the judge if they're not taking a medication, if it's not emergency against, like,
Okay.
and you want them to.
Okay.
That if it's like
Mhm.
like psychiatric medication, that the judge can be
Okay.
the one that is like, they need this, therefore.
Got it. Okay. Very helpful.
At least
Okay.
that's
Well,
what happened here. I wanted to just clarify because I'm like, I
no,
need to
I'm
make sure
glad.
I'm
Thank
giving
you.
you the right information.
Yes, I appreciate that very much. And so we are at the end of our time together for you, Haley. But again, thank you so much. I learned something from you every single time we communicate. And so thank you so much for today's information. It's really helped me to better understand things in a different way. And so with that, I'm going to shift our gears into a short break.